Years ago, I found a lovely reading by Anne Morrow Lindbergh in her book, Gifts from the Sea. Though I've read it at many wedding ceremonies, I believe it relates also to the kinds of relationships we create as we build community together. She wrote, "A good relationship has a pattern like a dance and is built on some of the same rules. The partners do not need to hold tightly because they move confidently in the same pattern, intricate but gay and swift and free, like a country dance of Mozart's. To touch heavily would be to arrest the pattern and freeze the movement, to check the endlessly changing beauty of its unfolding. There is no place here for the possessive clutch, the clinging arm, the heavy hand, only the barest touch in passing. Now arm in arm, now face to face, now back to back. It does not matter because they know they are partners moving to the same rhythm, creating a pattern together and being invisibly nourished by it. The joy of such a pattern is not only the joy of creation or the joy of participation, it is also the joy of living in the moment. Lightness of touch and living in the moment are intertwined." This is my iced tea for the morning, my drug of choice. Isn't it wonderful to finally be at this place together? I'm telling you, the search committee has taken such good care of me. Thank you, every one of you. And I did bring my butterfly stole for Carolyn and John. This week, as we consider the possibility of sharing the ministry of this fellowship, growing together, deepening the life of this community, and sharing the joys and sorrows as we build a family of faith together, it seemed appropriate to begin this service with one of the hymns that articulates the breadth and depth of what our life together might be. We laugh, we cry, we live, we die, we dance, we sing a song. It's all there. Who we want to be and who we want to be together. To me, this song articulates the covenant we make with one another. It seems that in recent years, Unitarian Universalists have begun to use the word covenant a great deal. I have a feeling y'all have heard it a bit in the last 2 years. When I was growing up as a United Methodist, I don't remember conversations in our church about covenants or considerations about how we wanted to relate to each other. At my church, we talked a great deal about living the teachings of Jesus, but we still didn't let people of color in the sanctuary. Things have come a long way, thank goodness, to talk openly about and strive toward deep, meaningful, inclusive relationships takes us closer to the heart of the teachings of our Unitarian Universalist faith. Covenants help us approach the heart of our relationships. But how does a covenant differ from a contract? With contracts, the lines are clearly drawn. There are clear sets of expectations and limits to the interaction. We sell a car and we create a contract. We buy a house, or wishful thinking in my case, we sell a house, and it's done. The relationship between a minister and a congregation certainly has some of those elements, but it's more. As we pursue the highest aspirations of the human spirit, both the minister and the congregation covenant to be more to each other than a contract can offer. What are some of the differences? Part of our covenant is a willingness to be vulnerable with each other, to intentionally choose to work with others to grow spiritually and emotionally through our interactions, and be willing to be changed, transformed by what we experience together. By choosing to be in covenantal relationship with one another, we reflect the true essence of the interdependent web of existence. In Hindu tradition, there's Indra's net, which is similar to our interdependent web, but at each point of connection on the web, there's a tiny bell that rings if touched, that rings if there's a vibration. Our web of relationships doesn't have such a gentle reminder of how we touch each other's lives, but the connections made still shape us. This week, as we consider a long-term relationship as congregation and minister, I hope we will begin to lay a foundation of trust and honesty as we get to know one another. This foundation is important because we cannot anticipate what lies before us. This trust will be the basis from which we create new rhythms for the life of this fellowship. These rhythms, patterns of movement, will emerge as we learn together. Like dance partners shaping a new pattern who learn to engage and move with a light touch, we will need to anticipate new movements that are yet unknown patterns, which may be exciting, but at times daunting in the life of this fellowship. Like many relationships in which we approach one another and then perhaps retreat a bit, it may be easy to judge a retreat or shifting movement as negative. But there is a balance that needs to be found in approach and retreat, for we are weaving a pattern together. As the great dancer Martha Graham once said, when weaving a blanket, an Indian woman leaves a flaw in the weaving of that blanket to let the soul out. There must be spaces in our shared lives in community so that in ways that are unique and appropriate for each of us, our spirits can find their true rhythm. It is in both the approach and retreat that our soul emerges. The metaphor of the dance, even for those of us like me who aren't dancers, reminds us that one of the things we all have in common is that when we learn something new, we often naively step on each other's toes. Some of the sweetest memories that I have of my children when they were very young is teaching them to dance. I put their feet on my feet. Any of y'all remember this? And move gently and slowly back and forth as they learn to dance. It reminds me of a little verse by the mystic Sufi poet Hafiz, part of which says, every child has known God, not the God of don'ts, but the God who knows only 4 words and keeps repeating them, saying, come dance with me. Come dance with me. Perhaps learning to be together in community reflects that invitation. We invite one another to be engaged in the slowly spiraling movement of approach and retreat. We learn the steps of what this community is like by watching and learning from those who have built this congregation in years past. Then, in moving out to explore the ways in which each of us can receive and contribute to this fellowship, we need to develop our own rhythm and moves. Being new to this community, a settled minister might find it takes a while to learn how to move among the activities of the life of this fellowship. Should we choose to be in a minister and congregational relationship next week, we need to figure out what we want and need from each other. We need to discern what the rhythm of our relationship will be and to understand that relationships in community, like all relationships, take work and practice. There is a learning and relearning that must take place. Several years ago, I had a concrete experience of learning new rhythms when I attended a retreat led by an academic and Aramaic scholar who's now one of my teachers. His teaching involves lecture as well as body prayer and movement similar to the dances of universal peace. I didn't realize when I was signing myself up for a 2-week intensive seminar that the other people in the group had been studying with him for 20 years. So I arrived in Edinburgh, Scotland, no place to retreat, not knowing how to move and without any rhythm or understanding of what this community of students was doing. Like our congregations, the people were very welcoming. As the seminar progressed, I was brought into the circle and sometimes literally dragged along until I began to understand the relationships between the lessons and the patterns of movement. Slowly, without a word being said, they mentored me in the norms and values of the group. Gradually, the times I bumped into people or stepped on them diminished. I lost my embarrassment about being new and about not knowing what to do and learned the nuances of that community, sustained by those who had welcomed me. I trust that you will drag me along with you until I learn the movements of this fellowship. In a covenantal community, we help one another learn the rhythms and shared values. As we gather, there is a profound learning that takes place, much of which is subtle and very often nonverbal. I remember once a member of the choir in one of my congregations was very shy, and she was struggling very hard with depression. One night at choir practice, another member of the choir simply looked at her and patted the chair next to her. And in that simple act, life shifted for her. Suddenly, there was a place where she knew that she was truly seen as precious and special. As she shared the story, tears came to her eyes. Even though she had been born and raised a UU, that one little act made her feel profoundly connected and accepted. We touch each other's lives in ways we cannot possibly know. There is a learning that happens when we gather, and there needs to be forbearance when we bump up against the fragile edges of congregational life. Things such as disagreements about worship styles and disagreements about how to engage in the larger community. It's those edges where we learn most from each other. The edge of creativity within our congregations often flows out of the places where we find anxiety and stress. I imagine that in the last few years, There may have been some anxious moments as you grappled with what kind of minister you want, with what to do about tight budgets and lean years, and the question of who will be the right minister for us. I'm sure the list could go on, and I hope this week to hear about some of that. At some point, as congregations and ministers, we have to come to the point of acknowledging that there are no perfect congregations. Sorry to break the news to you. And there are no perfect ministers. Sorry to break that news to you. In fact, it is our imperfections that teach us and lead us to new ways of being if we can honor the spirituality of imperfection. If everything were perfect, we wouldn't have any growing to do. And forbid that you should be bored. That is part of the dance we as minister and laity do together. We learn where our growing edges are. We find where our strengths are, build on those strengths, and practice new ways of moving in the dance that is this fellowship. To participate in the dance of community, we need to understand where our imperfections reside so that we can help one another. We need to be willing to be open, vulnerable, and trusting. That means the responsibility for creating emotionally, physically, and spiritually safe congregations resides with each one of us. It is not my job as minister. It is not your job as laity. It is our job as we share the ministry of this fellowship to create a community where it's safe to be ourselves, safe to be called into question, and safe to be respected for our differences. And let's face it, there are times when any one of us can say or do things that collide with the needs and perceptions of others. Perhaps we expect too much of each other, or perhaps we don't expect enough of each other. It's hard to know some days. We are imperfect in our words and actions, so even with our best intentions, we irritate one another. Or as I sometimes say to my children, you are stepping on my last nerve. And we bump up against the closely held beliefs of others. Forbearance and forgiveness often need to be in the forefront of our minds and hearts. I still remember my ordination when the United Methodist bishop asked me if I was going on to perfection. That is like one of my favorite phrases. Right there was the acknowledgement of my humanity, of our humanity. We are a good but imperfect lot. I thought of that reality a few weeks ago when I saw a column in the paper entitled, "Have Faith in the Imperfect." The article focused on clergy imperfections, acknowledging that we're all human. One of the examples was of a minister who, in leading a memorial service, intoned solemnly to the gathered mourners, "We thank you, God, for the gift of immorality." He corrected that statement real quick. As I read the article, I thought, those preachers have nothing on me. And I thought of some of my more public mistakes. And since you are considering our relationship together, I figured I might as well fess up a little bit. early on, because with me, what you see is what you get. So I want to be upfront about a couple of my more public faux pas. There was the time on the Sunday following September 11th. We can all remember that. People were in profound grief. The sanctuary was breathing room only, as I'm sure it was at this fellowship. And during Joys and Sorrows, someone got up to say that her rubber chicken, which was a prop for the church play, had been taken. I was so stunned at how totally inappropriate that was on that particular Sunday, that at the end of Joys and Sorrows, I said, "Let us bow our heads for a few moments of prayer and medication." Of course, then there was the wedding, where the bride was very shaky and very pale. I was so focused as I was talking on whether I could catch her if she passed out that I was not paying attention to my enunciation as I said, "Please repeat after me. With this ring I thee bed." I've got more, but I'll stop there. Thank goodness it made her laugh and she didn't faint. Maybe this week I'll share a few other stories. But the reality is that when we promise to choose to gather in community, we are choosing imperfection. But imperfection with trust that we will hold care and compassion for one another in the midst of our imperfection. We are incredibly fortunate to travel the path of life with people who can help us grow and laugh and work and play together. As Barbara DeAngelis reminds us, the journey between who you once were and who you are now becoming is where the dance of life really takes place. And so I invite us to join in our closing hymn, which reminds us of the invitation we offer one another as we share the dance to create this fellowship.